Alright, so um, this is my first time trying to do something like this. Apologies if it's a little rough. But this is my alternate history project presentation. I call it Krasnaya Imperiya, which is Russian for Red Empire, or what the Second World War could have been. So, first we have the premise. In this alternate timeline, Germany willingly demilitarizes after World War One. They do it voluntarily and propose it originally, like first during the uh, Treaty of Versailles. So this will have an lasting outcome on the German economy and global importance due to the fact that they will focus more on their post-war economy and modernizing. Um, it's basically what Japan did following World War II. It's just Germany is doing it following World War One. So the immediate results, the Treaty of Versailles could have been written much differently, since Germany has willingly agreed to dismantle their military and proposed it right out of the gate during peace talks. Um, the treaty could have been written more fairly and more leniently, which would have allowed Germany's economy to recover faster and beyond where it was in our timeline. Also, due to the fact that peace talks come to a close relatively quickly, while the First World War is horrible, it is more culturally viewed as just the new normal in terms of warfare in the 20th century. Now, what this means, since Germany's economy is better and recovering faster, um, the German people are they have a higher quality of life than they did in our timeline. They don't hold as much anti-foreigner sentiment, and they're not trying to find a scapegoat for their problems or someone to solve them because their problems aren't as severe as they were before. Due to this, radical groups like the National Socialism or Nazi Party will not be able to establish a foothold and reshape the country's government. Now, what comes next? Um, Due to Germany's demilitarization, they could not possibly start World War II. They don't want to, and they don't have much to gain for it. However, because Germany can't start World War II, that doesn't mean that World War II doesn't happen. The USSR is a large sort of communist empire, so they are most likely to wind up triggering World War II in this alternate timeline. I call it I called it Krasnaya Imperiya, which again is Russian for Red Empire. In this alternate timeline, World War II would occur when the USSR begins expanding very aggressively in the mid 1930s. Stalin, in an attempt to expand the USSR's access to resources and global sphere of influence, begins supporting communist coups in its border countries like Estonia, Latvia, Afghanistan, between the years of 1936 and 1937, I think. Um, Now, in our timeline, France and Britain declared war on Germany after Germany invaded Poland. The French Prime Minister even gave a speech in which he sort of justified this line of thinking by saying that Germany seeks to establish a dominion of the world completely different from any known in world history. At this point in time, the USSR is this massive sort of conglomerate, and it's just expanding further, like every few months. So it's very likely that this line of thinking could be applied to the USSR in this alternate timeline. It's the Franco-Soviet War. Because of Russia's expansion westward and into more Central European countries, this would trigger France and Britain to forcefully intervene to prevent them from just eating up all of Europe. So this would trigger the Franco-Soviet War, which is the alternate title for World War II, because it's mainly it mainly starts due to France intervening with Soviet expansion. France, Britain, Poland, and later Germany, the USA, and Japan, as well as other countries such as New Zealand, Australia, Canada, would become the alliance powers. The USSR, allied with China, form the Comintern and attempt to expand their borders and political sphere of influence. There would also be other countries involved in the Comintern. I'm just not entirely sure which ones. We could be seeing stuff like perhaps, without fascism, communist Spain occurs after the Spanish Civil War. It's likely that Stalin would have intervened during that. A brutal conflict. Because World War I was settled so amicably, it is culturally viewed as just the new standard for warfare. So trench warfare, chemical weapons, those are all still being used in the Franco-Soviet War. As a result, casualties are very high and little actual border changing occurs. In Asia, guerrilla warfare between Japanese Imperial forces and Chinese communist guerrillas would occur all around the nation, which would result in very little actual border changing, but there would be very violent, although short-lived, skirmishes. A turning point. Despite the Soviet Union's manpower and industry, Germany's infrastructure is better and more developed, and it allows the alliance forces to maintain constant supply and in this no man's land. Now, eventually, the USSR would begin to fall apart due to famines and the fact that they're not really making any headway in this war. They're kind of stuck in Poland. Aerial bombardment of industrial centers and supply lines would begin becoming the major offensive plays during this time, because both sides are kind of stuck in this massive no man's land, so they're just trying to take out each other's manufacturing so that one side can finally have more bullets than the other. The end draws near. Eventually, due to famine and bombing runs and higher and higher casualties, the Soviet war machine begins collapsing. And once the Soviet war machine collapses, Red China wouldn't be able to receive supplies, as the USSR would prioritize that towards their European front, and Japan would eventually stamp out Red Chinese revolutionaries in Asia. And after doing that, Japan would likely begin assaulting eastern Russia, which would put even more strain on their crumbling war machine. America would also begin intervening on the Western Front once they've seen how bad the war has been getting. Now, there is no there is no Pearl Harbor in this timeline. However, Russia being communist and so aggressively expanding into democratic countries could eventually trigger America's need to intervene. Victory for the alliance. Once Soviet infrastructure has collapsed and they're losing civilians in the thousands to famine, the USSR would eventually surrender. Either they would be forced to, or Stalin would try to maintain what little, land he had. In our timeline, approximately 85 million people died in World War II. That is 3% of the global population. In the Krasnaya Imperiya timeline, I believe that the final death toll would be about 5% of the population, or 115 million. And this would be due to the more brutal combat occurring during the conflict, specifically in Europe, as well as the large famines experienced by the USSR. The lasting effects. Cultural changes in Europe. The Franco-Soviet War would have a widespread impact across the nations of the world. France would suffer political unrest due to, one, the heavy casualties of the war, and two, the fact that before the war, the nation did have some communist leanings and support for it. To the modern day, France would be struggling against social unrest due to radical ideology groups who believe that the war wasn't justified and France should have tried to join the USSR as an ally. Germany would experience an industrial boom once they got done reconstructing their infrastructure and factories, and would become the true seat of economic power in Europe, likely becoming, or standing a contender to become, a global supplier of electronics and other consumer goods, such as Japan did in our timeline. Russia, following the deconstruction of the USSR, would be reduced to a near third world country. Poverty would be rampant due to the destruction of Russian infrastructure, and Russia's economy would never recover back to pre-war levels due to incredibly harsh post-war sanctions and the damage dealt to their infrastructure during the war. Also, America would become culturally more conservative than we are today. While not to the extent of the Red Scare during the 60s, American culture would develop a sort of cultural distrust of progressivist policy due to associating them with communism, which, as the USSR demonstrated, is a warmongering, hateful imperialist idea. In China, Maoist policies and government would never reform the existing government due to the fact that all communist leaders would be deposed or imprisoned or executed even following the war. So in the modern era, China is much more capitalist and democratic, and is more of a positive trade partner with America. In Japan, imperial tradition is never fully rejected. The empire is never made to abdicate, and Japan never, sees itself be an aggressor in the war. So it's likely that the imperial family and imperial government would survive into the modern era, and Japan would maintain a very large military in the Asian continent. Now, they are not nearly as economically powerful as they are today due to the fact that they don't fully devote their industrial power towards civilian industries, but they would still maintain some, you know, manufacturing influence. Also, due to the fact that communism has been forcefully dismantled, there wouldn't really be a North and South Korea, and if there was a Korean War, it would not be like it is today, and it wouldn't result in the country being divided. Um, Now, the Korean peninsula, the Korean nation, does not experience the same dramatic level of economic growth as South Korea in our timeline shows. Um, but this is just due to the fact that they're trying to cover twice the amount of land. They would still be a major power in the technology market. The face of the world today. American culture would be changed quite notably in the Krasnaya Imperiya alternate timeline, due to the fact that Germany does not commit, horrible war crimes and whatnot. The um, American families who have their seat in German immigrants would be much prouder of their German heritage, and German culture would likely be more embraced and openly expressed by the American people. Also, due to the shift in political views as a result of communist versus democratic ideologies in the Franco Soviet War, the American culture is more conservative than it is today. It's more of a conservative majority instead of a democratic majority. Um, Also, due to Germany's new seat as sort of a world manufacturing and industrial power, it's likely that they would have entered the tech market like China, Japan, and Korea have done today. Germany would likely make their own smartphones and their own video game systems, for example. And that's the end of my alternate history presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. It's my first time trying to do something like this, so I apologize if it's a little rough. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.